Everyone feared the billionaire mother, but the new maid wasn't supposed to speak, and when she did, the entire house held its breath. The Blackridge estate didn't just house wealth, it housed silence. The kind of silence that crawls under your skin and teaches you when to look down, when to disappear, when to pray you won't be noticed. For 3 weeks, Naomi Grayson had learned this silence well. She'd memorized which hallways echoed footsteps, which rooms Margaret Blackridge occupied, which hours were safest to breathe. This afternoon was not one of those hours. The living room stretched before her like a courtroom. Cream marble floors polished to mirrors, floor-to-ceiling windows that lead in cold light but no warmth, furniture arranged with the precision of wealth that had forgotten comfort. At the center of it all stood Margaret Blackridge, 57 years of calculated cruelty wrapped in a navy Chanel suit and pearl choker, her finger pointed like a loaded weapon, at Rosa, the housekeeper who'd been trembling for the last 5 minutes. "You think I pay you to be incompetent?" Margaret's voice could frost glass. "You think I built this empire by accepting mediocrity?" Rosa's shoulders shook. Her lips moved in what might have been prayer or apology. It didn't matter. Margaret didn't wait for answers. She delivered verdicts. Naomi stood 3 feet away, dust cloth forgotten in her hands, watching something inside her grandmother's voice awaken. That voice that used to say, "Baby girl, when you see wrong being done to the helpless, your silence becomes your sin." Behind them all, unseen in the doorway that led to the east corridor, Elliot Blackridge stood perfectly still. He'd come home early. He'd heard his mother's voice rising like it always did, sharp, absolute, unquestionable. He'd heard it his entire life. But today, instead of walking away like he always did, instead of drowning it out with emails and meetings and the comfortable distance money could buy, he stopped and he watched. There are moments when God doesn't send angels to intervene. He sends witnesses. He positions people in doorways and corners, in quiet spaces where truth can no longer hide from those who need to see it most. Naomi's hand moved to her chest. Her heart hammered against her palm like it was trying to escape. Every survival instinct screamed at her to stay invisible, stay employed, stay safe. But her grandmother's voice was louder. "Ma'am," Naomi's voice came out smaller than she intended, but it came out. "Please, that's not what happened." The room didn't just go silent, it stopped breathing. Margaret's head turned slowly, deliberately, like a predator noticing prey it hadn't known was there. Her eyes, ice blue and merciless, landed on Naomi with the weight of a judge's gavel. "Excuse me?" 2 words. That's all it took to remind everyone in that room who held the power, who signed the checks, who decided whether you ate next month or joined the dozens of others who'd been erased from this estate without a trace. But Naomi had already spoken. And God doesn't let truth walk backward. What happens when the quietest voice in the room carries the loudest truth? What happens when a 26-year-old maid decides her conscience costs more than her paycheck? What happens when a son finally sees his mother without the filter of loyalty? Keep watching, because what comes next doesn't just change a house. It exposes what power looks like when mercy finally holds up a mirror. Like, share this video and comment where you are watching from. But to understand how we got to this moment, to understand why Naomi's words carried the weight they did, why Elliot couldn't walk away, why Margaret's reaction was so visceral, we need to go back. Back to where this story really begins. To the house that breathed fear. The silence after Naomi spoke lasted maybe 3 seconds. But in those 3 seconds, the entire architecture of the Blackridge estate seemed to shift. The air grew heavier. The light from those floor-to-ceiling windows felt colder. Even the expensive furniture seemed to lean in, waiting to see what happened when someone broke the one unspoken rule that governed this house. You do not contradict Margaret Blackridge. Naomi's hand remained pressed against her chest, fingers trembling slightly, but her eyes stayed steady. She wasn't looking at Margaret with defiance. She wasn't even looking at her with anger. There was something else in her gaze, something that looked uncomfortably close to compassion, and that made everything worse. "Excuse me?" Margaret's voice dropped to that dangerous quiet that everyone who'd worked here knew meant devastation was coming. "Did you just correct me?" Rosa had gone completely still, tears frozen on her cheeks, terror and hope warring across her face. The other staff members who'd been pretending to work in adjacent rooms had stopped moving entirely. You could feel them listening, holding their breath, praying this new girl knew what she was doing. She didn't. But she did know what was right. "Ma'am, I was here when it happened." Naomi's voice still trembled, but it didn't break. Rosa didn't break the vase. It was already cracked. She was just trying to move it carefully when it finally gave way. She didn't do anything wrong. Courage doesn't always shout. Sometimes it trembles and speaks anyway. Sometimes it's a 26-year-old maid with shaking hands and a pounding heart, standing in a room full of marble and money, choosing truth over survival. Margaret took a step toward Naomi, and you could see it. That shift in her posture, that hardening in her eyes. This was the moment she usually destroyed people. The moment she reminded them exactly who held the power, who signed the checks, who decided whether you had a future or just became another cautionary tale whispered among the staff. "You've been here 3 weeks. Each word landed like ice. 3 weeks, and you think you can stand in my home and tell me what happened? You think your word means anything compared to what I know, what I've built, what I've earned the right to decide? I think," Naomi's voice wavered, then steadied, "I think the truth doesn't change based on who's been here longer." Rosa actually gasped, a soft, frightened sound that said what everyone was thinking. This girl just signed her own termination papers. But Naomi wasn't done. "My grandmother used to tell me something." Her voice softened, but somehow that made it more powerful, not less. She'd say, "Baby girl, God sees how we treat people who can't fight back. He sees it, He remembers it, and He holds us accountable for it. Ma'am, Rosa has 3 children. She works double shifts. She's never once complained, never once been disrespectful. She doesn't deserve this." The room didn't just go silent. It held its breath and waited for lightning to strike. Margaret's face had gone pale, then flushed, cycling through emotions faster than anyone had ever seen. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. For the first time in anyone's memory, Margaret Blackridge looked shaken. But then the armor came back. "How dare you?" Her voice shook with rage now, all pretense of control evaporating. "How dare you stand in my house and lecture me about God? You're a maid, a hired hand. You don't get to judge me. You don't get to tell me how to run my home, my staff, my life. You think your little prayers and your grandmother's wisdom make you special, make you righteous? You're nothing, nothing." The words were meant to destroy. They were weapons Margaret had used 1,000 times before, sharp, precise, designed to make people feel small enough to disappear. But something strange happened. Naomi didn't shrink. Her eyes filled with tears, yes. Her hands shook harder, but she didn't step back, didn't apologize, didn't run. She just stood there, steady in a way that had nothing to do with confidence and everything to do with conviction. And in the doorway, still unseen by everyone in that room, Elliot Blackridge felt something crack open inside his chest. Shame. It hit him like a physical blow. Shame for every time he'd heard his mother speak to someone like this and walked away. Shame for every staff member who'd quietly disappeared and he'd never asked why. Shame for building his entire life on the foundation of comfort while his mother built hers on cruelty. How many wrongs survive simply because good people stay quiet? How many injustices flourish not because evil is strong, but because those who could speak choose silence instead? Elliot had chosen silence his entire life. And watching Naomi stand there, this woman he'd never spoken to, who'd been in his house for less than a month, who had everything to lose and nothing to gain, watching her refuse to back down made him realize something devastating. She was braver than he'd ever been. Margaret was still talking, her voice rising, words tumbling out in a torrent of anger and wounded pride. But Elliot noticed something underneath it all, something he'd never heard before because he'd never stayed long enough to listen. Fear. His mother was afraid, not of Naomi, not of losing authority, of something else. Something buried so deep that Naomi's words about God and accountability had somehow unearthed it. You want to talk about God? Margaret's voice cracked slightly. You want to talk about judgment? You don't know anything about my life. You don't know what I've had to do, what I've had to become to build this. You don't know. She stopped abruptly, like she'd almost said something she couldn't take back. And in that moment, Elliot saw it clearly. His mother wasn't just angry at being contradicted. She was angry at being reminded of something, someone, some choice made long ago that still lived in the shadows of this beautiful, terrible house. Naomi saw it too. Her expression shifted from determination to something softer, something that looked like recognition. "Ma'am," she said quietly, "whatever you're carrying, it's not too late to put it down." Margaret's face went white, then red. Then she turned on her heel and walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing on marble like gunshots, leaving everyone standing in the wreckage of what had just happened, trying to understand how a conversation about a broken vase had somehow become about broken people instead. And as the echo of Margaret's departure faded into the depths of the house, Elliot finally stepped out of the doorway into the light. Everyone turned to look at him, but his eyes were only on Naomi, and the question in them was clear. What just happened here? What truth did you just speak that my mother couldn't face? Elliot's presence in the room changed everything. You could feel it. The way the staff straightened slightly, the way Rosa's terrified expression shifted to something that looked almost like hope. Because if the son had witnessed what just happened, if he'd seen his mother's cruelty and Naomi's courage, then maybe, just maybe, something could actually change. Margaret's authority, which had seemed unshakable for decades, suddenly felt fragile, like a tower built on sand that someone had finally noticed was shifting. "How long have you been standing there?" Margaret's voice came from the hallway where she'd retreated, trying to rebuild the composure that had cracked in front of everyone. "Long enough." Elliot's voice was quiet but steady. He walked fully into the room, and for the first time since anyone could remember, he didn't look like the absent son. He looked present, awake. "I heard everything." The staff exchanged glances. This was unprecedented territory. The son never intervened. The son never questioned. The son maintained the comfortable distance that wealth afforded. Until now. Margaret came back into the doorway, her face a careful mask again, but there was something desperate in her eyes. "Elliot, this is a household matter. Staff discipline doesn't concern." "Staff discipline?" His voice carried an edge no one had heard before. "Mother, that wasn't discipline. That was cruelty." The word hung in the air like an accusation that couldn't be unsaid. Margaret's mask cracked again. "You don't understand what it takes to run this estate, what it takes to maintain standards, to keep order, to destroy people?" Naomi's voice was so soft it almost disappeared, but everyone heard it. Is that what it takes? Margaret's eyes snapped to her, and for a moment the rage returned, but underneath it, something else surfaced. Something that looked uncomfortably like panic. You don't know anything. Margaret's voice shook. You stand there with your grandmother's wisdom and your 3 weeks of experience, and you think you understand anything about my life? About what I've... She stopped, caught herself, but it was too late. What you've what, Mother? Elliot took a step closer. What were you about to say? The silence stretched. In it, you could hear the house itself listening. All those expensive rooms and marble floors waiting to see if secrets buried for years would finally surface. There was a girl. Margaret's voice came out barely above a whisper. Years ago, before you were born, Elliot, she worked here, young, pregnant. She made a mistake, broke something valuable, and She closed her eyes. I fired her. Without references, without severance. I made sure no one in our circle would hire her again. Rosa's hand flew to her mouth. I found out later she lost everything. Her apartment, her stability, the stress. She lost the baby. Margaret's voice cracked. I told myself it wasn't my fault, that she should have been more careful, that standards mattered more than circumstances. I buried it with money, with power, with the justification that I was just running my household efficiently. Sin buried alive eventually starts knocking, and sometimes it takes a maid with trembling hands to finally open the door. Mother, Elliot's voice was barely controlled. Is this who we are? Is this who I've been protecting by staying silent? Margaret couldn't answer. The question hung between them like a chasm that had always been there, but no one had acknowledged until now. I thought... Margaret's voice broke completely. I thought if I maintained control, if I was strong enough, hard enough, that I could bury the guilt, that I could make it not matter. But every staff member I've destroyed since then, every person I've broken, it's like I'm trying to prove that what I did to her was justified. That cruelty is just strength. That fear is just respect. Tears ran down her face, and for the first time since anyone in this house could remember, Margaret Blackridge looked human, broken, small. Even the strong get tired of pretending. Even armor forged from decades of hardness eventually becomes too heavy to carry. I'm so tired. Margaret's words came out like a confession in a church she'd avoided for years. I'm so tired of being feared, of being this person, but I don't know how to be anything else. Naomi stepped forward, slowly, like approaching something wounded. Ma'am, it's not too late. It's never too late to choose differently. But Margaret shook her head. You don't understand what you're asking. This house, this life, this version of me, it's all I've built. If I stop being the woman everyone fears, what am I? You're human, Naomi said simply. That's enough. Elliot stood between his mother and the staff, between legacy and truth, between the comfortable lie he'd lived his entire life and the uncomfortable reality Naomi had forced into the light. His next words would determine everything, whether this house continued to breathe fear or finally learned to breathe something else, whether protection of image mattered more than protection of people, whether silence would win again or if truth would finally be allowed to stay. He opened his mouth to speak, and the choice that came out would change everything. Mother, Elliot said, his voice steady and clear, I love you, but I will not protect this anymore. He turned to face the staff members, who had gathered, drawn by the commotion, their faces a mixture of fear and fragile hope. Effective immediately, things change in this house. No one will be dismissed without cause and due process. No one will be humiliated for mistakes that are human. No one will work in fear. He looked at Rosa, then at Naomi. And anyone who has been wronged here will receive the apology they deserve. Leadership begins where ego ends. It begins the moment someone chooses principle over comfort, truth over tradition, people over pride. Margaret stood frozen, watching her son become someone she didn't recognize, or perhaps someone she'd always hoped he might become, but never had the courage to encourage. Elliot, her voice was small, the staff will think I'm weak. No, Mother. His eyes were compassionate but firm. They'll think you're human, and maybe for the first time, they'll have a reason to respect you instead of just fear you. He turned to Naomi, and there was something like awe in his expression. Thank you for having the courage I should have had years ago, for speaking when everyone else, including me, stayed silent. Naomi shook her head quickly, uncomfortable with the attention. Sir, I wasn't trying to be brave. I just couldn't watch someone be hurt for something that wasn't their fault. That's what bravery is, Elliot said gently. Doing what's right, even when you're terrified of the cost. But Naomi stepped back slightly, her hands clasped together. Please don't make me the hero of this story. My grandmother always said, Baby, if God gives you words to speak, those words aren't yours to take credit for. This wasn't about me. It was never about me. God didn't send an angel to shake the Blackridge estate. He sent a maid. Because that's how he works, through the humble, the overlooked, the ones who have nothing to gain except a clear conscience and everything to lose except their integrity. Margaret watched Naomi refuse the praise, refuse the spotlight, refuse everything except the truth she'd spoken. And something inside her that had been frozen for decades began to thaw. She walked slowly toward Rosa, each step looking like it cost her something. When she reached the housekeeper, she did something no one in that house had ever seen her do. She lowered her head. Rosa, Margaret's voice trembled, I'm sorry. For today. For every day before today. For making you afraid in a place where you should have felt safe. I have no excuse. I can only ask if you might someday forgive me. Rosa's tears came freely now, but they were different tears, not tears of fear, tears of release. Ma'am, yes, I forgive you. Margaret turned to the other staff members, to faces that had learned to hide their humanity around her, and she said the words again. I'm sorry. To all of you. I became something I never meant to be, and I'm asking for the chance to become something better. The apology wasn't perfect. It wasn't eloquent. But it was real. And real is what had been missing from this house for far too long. In the days that followed, something shifted in the Blackridge estate. It was subtle at first. Staff members made eye contact in hallways. Laughter echoed from the kitchen. Mistakes were corrected with patience instead of punishment. The house that had held its breath for years finally exhaled. Margaret began attending a small church downtown. She didn't announce it, didn't make a show of it. She just went quietly, like someone who'd finally admitted she needed something she couldn't provide for herself. Elliot spent more time at home, not hiding in his office, but present, learning the names of staff members he'd passed for years without seeing, asking questions, listening to answers, becoming the kind of leader who served rather than ruled. And Naomi continued her work, quietly efficient, still arriving early and staying late, still preferring to remain unseen. But now, when she walked through the house, she no longer felt the weight of fear pressing down on her shoulders. One evening, as the sun set through those floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the marble floors gold instead of cold, Elliot found Naomi in the library, dusting shelves with the same careful attention she brought to everything. "Can I ask you something?" he said. She turned, surprised. "Of course, sir. How did you know? How did you know speaking up was worth the risk?" Naomi was quiet for a moment, considering. Then she smiled softly. "My grandmother used to say that courage is just faith in action, that when you see wrong happening and God gives you the words to address it, staying silent becomes its own kind of sin. I was more afraid of disappointing God than I was of losing this job." Elliot nodded slowly. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She is." Naomi's eyes shone. "She's probably praying for this house right now. She prays for everywhere I work." "Then maybe," Elliot said quietly, "her prayers are the reason everything changed." As Naomi left the room, she whispered under her breath, soft enough that only God could hear, "Thank you for giving me the words. Thank you for protecting me when I spoke them. Thank you for showing this house what mercy looks like." And Elliot, standing alone in that golden light, realized something profound. Faith had walked through his door wearing a maid's uniform. Courage had arrived trembling but unbroken. Truth had spoken softly and shaken foundations. And a house that had breathed fear for decades had finally learned how to breathe again.